right, my young friends, we are picking up here from our last podcast where we had begun talking about nutrient or biogeochemical cycles. We had talked about the water cycle and probably most importantly for us in biology, the carbon cycle, where we learned about how carbon goes from the environment to plants to animals and then back into the environment again. Remember, bio-geo kind of means we're going to spend the nutrient in question is going to spend part of its time in living things and part of the time out in the environment. So what we're going to talk about now is another very important element, nutrient for living things, and that is nitrogen. And it also goes through a biogeochemical or nutrient cycle. It's called the nitrogen cycle. Okay, now the thing you need to understand about nitrogen is that you, just like with carbon, you absolutely must have it as a living thing. It is not the centerpiece of all organic compounds, all the molecules in your body like carbon is. Carbon truly is the centerpiece. Without carbon, there would be no molecules that we know of, at least as we understand them, for life. But nitrogen is also very critical, and without it, you still wouldn't have DNA, you wouldn't have proteins. Nitrogen is also very critical. It just isn't the centerpiece. So the other thing you need to understand is not only do you desperately need nitrogen to make all of the molecules in your body, but you are swimming in it right now. All around you, in the air all around you, is nitrogen gas, and we write that as N2. Chemically, nitrogen gas is two nitrogen atoms chemically bound together. Now, the thing about this N2 that is in our atmosphere right now, 70% of the air you breathe. So we're going to breathe in. Okay, and we're going to breathe out. All right, 70% of the air I just breathed in was nitrogen gas. What I'm getting out of it when I breathe in, though, is the oxygen. Even though I am breathing in this nitrogen that I desperately need, and I am breathing in tons more nitrogen gas than I am oxygen gas, the nitrogen gas goes right back out again unchanged. So I am taking in N2 and I am expelling N2 absolutely unchanged. My body can't do a thing with it. It goes in and it goes out unused, even though I desperately need it. Why? Well, N2, nitrogen gas, is inert. And what that means is it's very, very stable. It is very happy, quote unquote, being a nitrogen gas. It is extremely stable. It does not readily engage in chemical reactions because it is very stable the way it is in its state as N2. So when we breathe it in, it doesn't do much in us and it goes right back out again completely unchanged. So even though we are swimming in nitrogen and we desperately need it, and we can breathe it in all day long, we can't really get it into our bodies and use it in this form, unfortunately. So we have to use it, get it, and use it in other ways. So why is nitrogen needed by us? We use it just like we use carbon in that it is one of the many compounds used to make our proteins, to make our DNA, which really are the molecules that make us, okay? Now, there are different forms of nitrogen. We've already mentioned nitrogen gas, and it is inert, but there are other forms as well. Ammonia, nitrates, and nitrites. These are different forms of nitrogen gas. Ammonia is written NH3. Nitrites, I believe, are NO2, and nitrates, I believe, are NO3. You see all of these have the element nitrogen in common, but what's different about these from this is that these are far more reactive, okay? And that'll become important in a bit. All right, now, please forgive the homemade nature of this diagram, but this was, I didn't like, the books and things seem more confusing, at least to me, so this is probably confusing to you as well, but we're going to use this diagram. What the little circles represent are places we're going to number the stages. I think it's helpful for you to follow the stages of the nitrogen cycle, and we're going to walk through this diagram, okay? And we're going to start here with number 1. So just put a number 1 on your diagram. This diagram should be on the very back page of your handout. Okay, where we are starting is with this nitrogen gas that is 70% of our atmosphere, okay? It is everywhere. It is plentiful, okay? Now, but as I just said, most living things cannot use it. We certainly cannot. But plants can't use nitrogen gas in this inert N2 form either, okay? So, what we're going to do then is follow the magic arrow down to things that can use it. There are organisms on Earth that, fortunately for us, can harness this nitrogen gas and put it into a form that is usable for living things. And these organisms are called nitrogen fixing bacteria. And if you remember nothing else from this diagram, you ought to remember nitrogen fixing bacteria, okay? They can occur in the soil, which is what I'm trying to indicate down here with these little circles. They're supposed to be bacteria living in the soil, but they can also occur in little nodes or nodules in the roots of certain plants. There's a certain family of plants called legumes, and if you hear that, basically we're talking beans, I think bean type plants are very commonly associated with this sort of bacteria. The bacteria live in these little bumps in the roots of these plants. And in fact, they engage in what is called, here's another term for you, a symbiotic relationship with these plants. And in particular, a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. A symbiotic relationship is one in which two entirely different species live in very close association with each other. And these plants and these bacteria do. Mutualistic or mutualism implies that both organisms, the plant and the bacteria, benefit from this relationship, okay? And that's the type of relationship the plants have with these bacteria. What happens is the bacteria are able to take in the nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and convert it to a usable form. So that provides the plants with usable nitrogen. What it does for the plant does for the bacteria is it gives it a nice sheltered place to live and a food source, because as we know, plants are doing photosynthesis all the time and so on, so they have a ready supply of sugar and things to provide to the bacteria as well. Now, so if we follow, we're going to follow our arrow down to nitrogen fixation, so that'll be 2. Indeed, I probably should make this a 2 and this a 2, because this is where nitrogen fixation is happening. It is happening in some nitrogen fixing bacteria that are in the soil and some that are associated with plant roots. Now, here is what nitrogen fixing bacteria do. They take this N2 gas that is useless as it is and convert it to a form that is useful to living things. And that is a form called NH3. That's what we learned about is ammonia. Now, if you have ever smelled ammonia, you probably know that you really don't want to take a big swig of this stuff. But plants can use ammonia, okay? So what they do, and I'm going to put a number 3 right here, plants will take the ammonia provided to them by their mutualistic partners in their roots, or that they just take up from the soil that has been released by the nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil. Either way, they get it. They will take up this ammonia and use it in their own bodies. How will they use it? Well, they will convert the ammonia into the very tissues of the plant's own body. They will convert it into protein. They will convert it into DNA, and that is the very stuff that the plant's leaves and body is made of. So that ammonia will get converted to the plant's own DNA and proteins and other molecules that are making up its very body. Okay, so now it's no longer noxious NH3 that stinks and all that. It's converted to the plant tissues, the DNA and the protein. Now that we've got the ammonia converted into DNA, into protein, and so on that is making up the plant's body, it's easy to see how this nitrogen is going to now be made available up the food chain, because guess who gets to eat the plant? So this will be number 4. Animals come along and eat the plant tissue, the plant DNA, the plant protein that has this ammonia, well, not ammonia, sorry, that has the nitrogen from the ammonia now stored in a different way in the form of DNA and protein. And we eat that plant tissue. This DNA and protein from the plant gets broken down, and we use it to make our own body tissues, our own DNA, our own proteins, and so on. Now, eventually, either this plant or the animal is going to die. So that is step 5 in the process. And when any living thing dies, it gets decomposed, okay? Assuming it dies a natural death out in the environment. It decomposes. What this means is decomposers, and these are different bacteria. Bacteria and fungus are also decomposers, fungi, are going to decompose the DNA and proteins in the plant and in the animal back to ammonia. This again is converting these DNA protein stuff back into ammonia. This process is called ammonification. And so right here we see, and I'm gonna we'll number this 7. Here we have this ammonia that is now in the soil from the decomposition of the dead plant or the dead animal. And this ammonia that is in the soil can now either go back into the cycle, being directly taken up by the plant and used just like this was, or the ammonia, and this will be a number 8 possibility, can go and be taken up by different bacteria that also live in the soil, okay? If it is taken up by nitrifying bacteria in the soil, okay, and here's that word, nitrifying bacteria. Nitrifying bacteria can do one of 2 things. They can convert the nitrogen into nitrates or into nitrites. If they convert it to nitrates, this form of nitrogen can also be taken up by plants. So this could go back into the cycle as well, okay? But if the nitrifying bacteria, these little dudes here that are taking up this ammonia, convert it to nitrites, plants can't use that form. I don't know why, I don't know the chemistry of it, I just know they can't really use this form. And if these little nitrifying bacteria convert the ammonia to nitrites, then these nitrites will get consumed by one last type of bacteria called denitrifying bacteria. And what they will do is they will take this NO2 and convert it back to N2, okay? And this we will call step 9. And the N2 will then just release from the soil and go straight back into the atmosphere, where we can do the whole process over again, okay? So, really important. I'm going to now move on from this, and let's try to anchor down some of these terms that you should know about the nitrogen cycle. First, you should know about nitrogen gas. Very plentiful, but not usable to most living things, unless you happen to be a nitrogen-fixing bacteria. If you are a nitrogen-fixing bacteria, then you can take this N2 and convert it to a usable form. We call this process nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen gas is changed into a form that can be used by living things. The first thing that the bacteria do is they change it to ammonia. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria are going to change nitrogen gas to ammonia. Now, plants can then take up the ammonia and use it to make their own body tissues. And then, of course, the animals can get it. And when the plants or animals die, the decomposers come into the picture. And also when you leave waste products or so on. The decomposers are going to convert the plant and animal tissues, the DNA and the proteins, back into ammonia and just return that ammonia to the soil. Okay? Now, once that ammonia is back in the soil, the plants can just take that up again, or other bacteria can further convert that ammonia to other things. And we call these bacteria nitrifying bacteria. And so they would take the ammonia from the decomposers and convert it to either nitrates. And if they do that, those nitrates can again be taken right up by the plants just like ammonia was. But some nitrifying bacteria convert ammonia not to nitrates, but to nitrites. And if they do that, nitrates, for whatever chemical reason, cannot be used by plants or animals, but they can be used by a last type of bacteria called denitrifying bacteria. And those convert nitrates back into nitrogen gas, which is going to go back into the atmosphere and begin our cycle all over again. Okay? All right, that's the nitrogen cycle. The phosphorus cycle, by comparison, is really easy. Phosphorus is another element, I believe it is written just simply as P, that is essential for life. Again, it's found in DNA, it's found in lots of things. So, phosphorus in the biogeochemical cycle of phosphorus is initially found in rocks and soil. It's part of the chemistry of many rocks. We need it in our bodies, okay, to make DNA and other molecules. Now, this is much more straightforward. Once it's in the rocks erode, the bits of phosphorus go into the soil, plants take it up from the soil. Of course, animals then eat plants. Dead plants and animals die, they decompose, they return the phosphorus to the soil. Okay? You don't get much more straightforward than that, okay? Take it up from the soil. The plants take it up from the soil, animals eat the plants, plants and animals die, return the phosphorus to the soil, it gets taken up again, and so on. Now, I do want you to think of something, we will address this later on, nutrient limitation. If a nutrient is in poor supply in an environment, this will limit the number of organisms that can live in that particular environment. Okay? So, suppose you got plenty of carbon dioxide all around, plenty of phosphorus, plenty of water. But if you don't have any usable nitrogen, then there won't be as much life as potentially there could be. So that nitrogen then becomes a limiting factor. And again, we'll talk about limiting factors a little bit later on. It's a limiting factor. It's going to limit the number of organisms that can live in an area because you don't have enough of this particular nutrient, even though you've got plenty of everything else, okay? Now, could there be too much of a nutrient in an ecosystem? How can there be too much of a nutrient? Nutrients are good. They provide us with stuff that we need to live. But the answer is yes, okay? And I want you to pay very close attention to this term. You will need to know it. Eutrophication is the term for what happens when there is too much of a nutrient, particularly in an aquatic, water-based ecosystem. Okay? Here is generally what happens in eutrophication. I go outside right here at my house and I put down lots of fertilizer because I want my grass to grow pretty and green. Okay? But it comes along and rains, and because I put so much fertilizer on my land, I put too much perhaps, a lot of that fertilizer just runs off into the little creek that runs beside my house. That little creek runs into the pond nearby, okay, and the algae begins to grow in excess. Why does the algae begin to grow? Well, the algae begins to grow because up until that time, there hadn't been quite so much nitrogen in that pond, but that nitrogen was kind of a limiting factor. The lack of nitrogen in the pond kept the algae from growing too much, from going crazy. Now I've added nitrogen to that pond because I allowed the runoff to grab all this fertilizer from my lawn, and now the algae is growing to excess because I gave it a bunch of nutrient that it was lacking in the pond. Now, the thing is, once you get a lot of algae growing, eventually a lot of that algae is going to die. Eventually you may get a thick algae mat on the top, and some of that algae begins blocking light from algae and layers beneath it, and so the algae just begins to die in large amounts. Well, of course, we already know that when things die, they get decomposed. They get decomposed by bacteria and other things. So bacteria begin to decay the dead algae. Now, bacteria, though, when they are eating algae, they are doing cellular respiration, are they not? Remember, cellular respiration is the food plus the oxygen give us water, CO2, and energy. So the bacteria are eating the dead algae, combining that with oxygen that's in the water, and they are using it to get energy and grow and do their bacterial thing. But they are indeed consuming oxygen. And there will be so much bacteria because there's so much of a food source. They reproduce, they reproduce, they reproduce. And the next thing you know, they consume all of the oxygen out of that pond. And eventually you begin to have a fish kill because there is no oxygen in that pond to provide to anything else because the bacteria have essentially sucked it all out. And so essentially the pond just dies. And that's all because I put too much fertilizer on my lawn. Okay? This happens in the Chesapeake Bay every year because I'm not the only one that put too much fertilizer on my lawn. By the way, I don't do anything to my lawn because it's all I can do to, keep my house from being condemned. So my lawn doesn't look that great. But be that as it may, lots and lots of us put fertilizer and stuff on our lawns, farm fields use it and so on, and it does get run off into the nearby creeks, into the James River, and of course we know the James River feeds into the Chesapeake Bay, and it's certainly not the only river that feeds into the Chesapeake Bay. So all of this nutrient pours into the bay, and as a result, there is a zone in the middle of the bay that does reappear every year, and that zone lacks oxygen because of the bacterial consumption of oxygen due to algae decay and so on. It is due to this eutrophication process. The dead zone actually varies in size. Some year it's bigger than others, but the overall trend seems for it to be getting somewhat bigger each year, hopefully as more and more people become knowledgeable about nitrogen and fertilizer pollution and stuff in eutrophication. Hopefully the size will reduce. But here you can see this was back in 2005, so this is a graphic from some time ago. The red shows there is zero oxygen, and look at this large chunk of the Chesapeake Bay where there is zero oxygen. Nothing can live in that. The yellow shows poor, the green fair, and the blue is where it is really healthy. Anyway. So that's a little bit about nutrient cycles, the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, and the bad things that can happen when there is too much nutrient, in particular in an aquatic environment. Eutrophication. Don't forget it. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next podcast. Take care.